Joining us now is Robert Kuttner. He is a journalist and author of a new book, The Squandering of America, How the Failure of Our Politics Undermines Our Prosperity. You can see it there on your screen. Mr. Kuttner, I want to get your reaction to several newspaper articles this morning about different issues. Here's the front page of the USA Today. Health insurance crisis. Traditional pensions are almost gone. Is employer-provided health insurance next? What do you think?
Yes, employer-provided health insurance is next. And of course, this is not something we have to worry about in the future. This is already happening. What's happening is that employers are restraining their own costs by shifting more and more of the costs to their employees, either in the form of deductibles or co-pays or whole categories of treatment that aren't covered. Something like 50% of the people who declared medical bankruptcy last year had insurance. So we already have a crisis of underinsurance. It's because we have these spiraling cost increases and employers cut their own costs by passing them on to employees. Pensions even worse. The traditional pension of the past is just vanishing, and a 401k plan is not a pension. It's just tax-deferred savings. If you live too long, if you're retired at a time when the stock market's down, nothing's guaranteed. You're on your own.
In your book, you link these issues to politics. So how is this issue linked to politics?
Well, I think most Americans would prefer to have the kind of secure health insurance and secure retirement coverage that they enjoyed a generation ago. And the problem is that neither party, although I think the Democrats do it somewhat better than the Republicans, but neither party is really putting on offer a solution. The solution is to pay for health insurance socially, like every other country does. The solution is to pay more of retirement coverage socially so that your ability to have secure retirement is not a function of the vagaries of which employer you happen to work for. You're not caught in this so-called pre-existing condition trap if you lose your job or shift employers. Pre-existing condition, you know, is not a medical term. It's an insurance company term. And in countries that have universal health insurance, or in our case, where the one universal part of the system is Medicare, there's no such thing as a pre-existing condition. If you go in, you're covered, they treat you. End of story.
Well, here's the Wall Street Journal opinion piece today by John Graham, and he says the health cost myth. And he says that he notes Europeans spend less on health care and earn less too, and this is the argument he makes, that health coverage is indeed becoming more expensive for businesses. Over the past 8 years, the percentage of firms offering health benefits to employees has dropped significantly. This decline, however, is almost completely accounted for by businesses with fewer than 10 employees. And then he goes on to say that what about the share of gross domestic product spent on healthcare, a metric of health system performance and value that some consider definitive? The United States leads the pack in this regard, spending far more on health than any other countries. Surely this puts the U.S. at a competitive disadvantage, doesn't it? No, it's the other way around. Americans' high productivity gives us the ability to spend more on health care, especially the latest treatments and technologies, than other developed nations that labor under forms of socialized health care.
Yeah. Well, that's the Wall Street Journal, and I think it's predictable nonsense. I mean, if you read the Post this morning, Walter Robinson has a column quoting a definitive study by the Commonwealth Fund that points out that we spend something like 16% of our GDP on health care. The average advanced country spends about 10%. They cover everybody. They have better health outcomes than we do. Most interestingly, public opinion polls show that their people are more satisfied with their health coverage. People live longer. Another really interesting statistic is that the countries with universal health insurance, more people are able to get an appointment with their doctor the same day. More people have a regular doctor. So the productivity of Americans and the productivity of Europeans, that's a case of confusing the debate by changing the subject. That's unrelated to health care. If we have an inferior health care system, we need to solve the health care system.
You also talk about income and the different incomes between the rich and poor and the middle class. And this is an article that we read in the first half an hour of today's program. Middle class dream eludes African-American families. Many blacks worse off than their parents, study says. And so what do you talk about in the book on this issue?
Well, I think it isn't just African-Americans. I think that a generation ago, when we had a more balanced form of capitalism, when we tempered private markets with public investments, when people had more secure health insurance and retirement insurance, retirement coverage. People were less likely to lose their jobs to outsourcing. People could afford to become homeowners. It was easier for young people who did not have wealthy parents to make it into the middle class. And I think the widening of inequality and the increasing insecurity particularly hits young Americans in their 20s and 30s. I have a young colleague who made the observation that, you know, when I'm in my 20s and I have this nifty iPod and all these neat gadgets, I feel rich. But when I hit 30 and I'm going to want to start a family and I'm going to want to buy a home, I'm going to realize that I'm poor. And I think more and more young Americans who don't get staked to their first home by their parents, who don't have their college tuition paid for by their parents so that they start out with huge loans, face a much steeper climb into the middle class than was the case a generation ago.
We're talking with Robert Kuttner. He is the economics editor for the New Republic, or previously was, yes, co-editor of the American Prospect magazine and author of this new book, Robert Kuttner, The Squandering of America, How the Failure of Our Politics Undermines Our Prosperity. Phone lines, Democrats 202-737-0002, Republicans 202-737-0001, and Independents 202-628-0205. There seems to be a contradiction to what you're saying in, again, the Wall Street Journal. They are reporting on a new report that's going to come out by the Treasury Department today. And it says that U.S. income mobility is going up, and that the Treasury study examined a huge sample of 96,700 income tax returns from 1996 and 2005 for Americans over the age of 25. The study tracks what happened to these tax filers over this 10-year period. One of the notable and reassuring findings is that nearly 58% of filers who were in the poorest income group in 1996 had moved into a higher income category by 2005.
Yeah, well, again, the Wall Street Journal editorial page is notorious for misusing statistics. It's as bad as the rest of the Wall Street Journal is good. There is no other study in town or anywhere else that thinks that the American income distribution is getting more equal. Every reputable study shows that over the past 30 years, and more dramatically, most dramatically since 2000, the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and the top 1% and the top 1/10 of 1% are doing best of all. The median income of Americans, if you adjust for inflation, has barely budged since the late 1970s, even though this is a period when the productivity of the economy has almost doubled. And I would have to go look at the numbers, but they are so out on their own in making this claim that it boggles the imagination. No one else believes this.
All right, first phone call, Lake Zurich, Illinois, Republican line.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. Are you familiar with David Walker, the Comptroller of the Office of General Accountability?
Government accountability, yes.
Government accountability.
Yes, I am.
He's talking about the burning platform that our economy is on, and it is a result of the unfunded liabilities of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the federal pensions to the tune of about $50 to $60 trillion over the next 50 years approximately. And I don't understand how you can suggest that the government take on this burden when we are putting this health care burden on our grandchildren, and the only guy that has the answer to this stuff is Ron Paul. He is suggesting that we get away from government regulation. He is suggesting to allow the market work. When you have a cartel that would control medical care, as the American Medical Society is, and you would have unlimited demand by people demanding health care, you have nothing but rising costs.
Let's get a response, caller.
Well, first of all, just on the facts, the countries that have universal systems spend about 10% of their total national income on health care. We spend 16%. Talk about a cartel. In this country, we have a private insurance cartel that takes 20 or 30 cents on the health dollar for marketing, for making sure that they don't insure people who might get sick, for profit. And it's a wildly inefficient system that leaves people with less choice and worse health outcomes than universal systems. But I particularly want to address the caller's allegation about Social Security. The other night in one of the presidential debates, Tim Russert went after the Democratic field to challenge them to fix Social Security. Are you going to do it by raising taxes, or are you going to do it by cutting benefits. And I was rather discouraged that none of them had the nerve to say to him, Social Security over the long term is not broken. The projected long-term deficit in Social Security is about a little more than half of 1% of 1 year's GDP. And you only get to that pessimistic projection by using very pessimistic assumptions about the U.S. economy. The Social Security trustees, a majority of whom were appointed by President Bush, who would like to privatize Social Security, project that the economy is only going to grow at 1.8% a year. Nobody else in town thinks that the economy is going to do that badly. So I think the Social Security crisis is much exaggerated. The Medicare crisis, which is serious, is a function of Medicare being separate from the rest of the health insurance system. And if you look at what's going on Wall Street right now, with the subprime meltdown and the big losses that the big banks are facing, again, that's a consequence of deregulation. That's not the free market working. Social Security looks pretty good compared to what's going on Wall Street right now.
And you make that argument in your book.
Yes, I do.
So talk a little bit more, explain a little bit more that Social Security and Medicare, what people are talking about, is not the real issue.
Right.
The issue is the subprime market and tax laws. So talk about that a little bit more in your book.
Well, I think we have had an experiment for almost 30 years now, most emphatically in the past 10 years. We've had a test of the proposition that financial markets do best when they're not regulated. And I think the free market view flunked. I mean, look at what's going on with subprime. This was a case where predatory lenders who were put in business by big Wall Street banks extracted huge fees that the banks shared in and the bond rating agencies shared in by making loans to people whose common characteristic was that they were unlikely to pay the loans back as soon as the teaser rate reverted to the loan's real rate, which was typically 3 or 4 or 5% higher, percentage points higher than a normal loan. And somehow the private bond rating agencies, which were paid fees by the banks that originated this whole process, sprinkled some holy water on these dubious loans and said these were AAA bonds. How can you take a loan that is unlikely to be paid back and turn it into a AAA bond? But they did it. And the banks not only sold these off to their customers, extracting huge fees, but they were foolish enough to keep some of them in their own portfolios. So now you've got banks taking multi-billion-dollar losses. The Treasury, which is part of the U.S. government, is having to organize a rescue. The Fed, which is part of the U.S. government, is having to organize a rescue. Now, when the Fed and the Treasury have to get into the act, this is not the market correcting itself.
And you call for the domestication of capitalism. What does that mean?
Well, I think until the 1970s, we had a version of capitalism that was balanced. Entrepreneurs were free to do their thing, and they did beautifully. It was a boom period. But the tendency of Wall Street to occasionally go haywire, as it did in the great crash of 1929 or the panic of 1907, was moderated by the fact that we had regulation, the tendency of a free market system to generate insecurity and inequality for ordinary people was moderated by the fact that government played a more proactive role and trade unions had a greater degree of influence on wage setting. And that economy is up in smoke. And as a result, ordinary people have less security. Income distribution is much more unequal. It's harder to make it into the middle class. And the whole financial system is shakier. So I think the turning away from a mixed form of capitalism, a more balanced form of capitalism, was a mistake. It was unfortunately a mistake, sometimes colluded in by both parties. This is deeply politicized. This didn't just happen. This was the influence of big money on politics. And our system would be much better off if we reverted to a greater degree of balance.
Let's get to another phone call here. Fort Wayne, Indiana. Thank you for waiting.
Good morning. I just have to say that I have to disagree with your numbers, because if you look at the unemployment rate, it's lower now than it ever was in the 90s. And every time it seems like when they talk about, how many jobs were created, everybody's surprised. It's sort of like the skunk putting a mask on and putting rings on his tails and trying to pass himself off as a raccoon when at the end of the day he's still going to stink, and I think you're a very dishonest man, sir.
Mr. Kuttner.
Well, happy to respond to that. You know, what's interesting is that we're creating a lot of jobs, but what we're not doing is creating jobs that people can live on. Someone said that, look at all the jobs the economy has created, and the person replied, yeah, I know, I have 3 of them. I mean, people are having to work 2 and 3 jobs. The blue-collar middle class is at tremendous risk because the decent factory jobs are just not being created. And we're not replacing good factory jobs with good service sector jobs. So we are creating jobs, absolutely, but too many of them are jobs that are either insecure or don't pay very well or don't have benefits.
Next phone call. Clinton, South Carolina, Republican line.
Good morning, C-SPAN. It's always nice to talk to a socialist early in the morning. You know, I remember when Hillary Clinton created her health care plan in 1993. All it did was cut out freedom, and it forced doctors to have to go to the government to decide where they're going to practice, what they're going to get paid, who I could pay myself for my own private care if I wanted to opt out of the system, or pay the taxes and decide, okay, on my own, I want to go out and pay my own private doctor for better service. She would make that illegal. I think all you socialists do is cut down on freedom, and then you judge us for it and act like we're unethical or something, just because we want freedom and we don't want a big bloated government. You know, you always talk about Europe and their plans, why they're so cheap. Maybe it's because this country we're, you know, more overweight, less in shape, take care of ourselves less. We need more services, and we pay for a lot of the research that those countries aren't. So you really have to look at this all in totality. But please, one last thing. A person in this country just barely making over $100,000 a year is already paying when you include state sales tax, state income tax, federal tax, FICA, all the things you socialists like to add on. We're already up to, 40% in income tax? I don't know where you think you're going to get any much more to pay all these things.
So what is your
first
solution
of all,
for paying for all these things?
Right. First of all, let's stop the name calling. I mean, I'm not a socialist. But let's look at freedom and health insurance plans. Which is the health plan that has the greatest degree of freedom, that gives you complete freedom to pick your doctor, to pick your hospital, to not be told you have a pre-existing condition, to not be denied a test that you might need? It's Medicare. It's the one part of the system that's government-sponsored and that's universal. So I think the idea that the present mess that we have with HMOs telling doctors what they can do and telling patients which doctors and hospitals they're allowed to see, that's the opposite of freedom. And the one oasis of universal coverage, Medicare, is freedom. It's true that the tax burden has been shifted much too much onto the middle class. It's true that people making between $20,000 and $100,000 are overtaxed, but that's because the very top are undertaxed. It used to be that corporate taxes paid a much higher percentage of the freight. It used to be that payroll taxes were much more moderate, and today the average worker pays more money in payroll taxes than in income taxes. So I think the average person needs tax relief, but this is a wealthy economy, and we can afford the services that we need, and sometimes by providing those services universally, we enhance freedom.
Just a quick response from Jonah Goldberg today, an opinion piece in the Los Angeles Times, on your point about the wealthiest Americans. He said, Democrats talk about the richest 1%, a diverse cohort of investors, managers, entrepreneurs, and to be sure, some fat cat heirs. One gets the impression that wealthy Americans are a natural resource to be pumped for as much cash as we need. He concludes by writing, but I'm pretty sure that it's unhealthy for a democracy when the majority of citizens don't see government as a service they reluctantly paying for, but as an extortionist that cuts them in for a share of the loot. Are you saying that are you saying that wealthy Americans should be pumped for as much cash as we need?
Well, I think a kinder way of saying that would be people should be taxed based on their ability to pay. And until recently, that's been the American philosophy. We've had a progressive tax system where ordinary working people who have to spend every nickel just to make ends meet are taxed at a lower rate than very wealthy people who can afford to pay higher taxes. Here's a bone-chilling statistic. The 2 richest men in America have more money than the bottom 140 million Americans. And one of those two richest men, Warren Buffett, is actually part of a group called Responsible Wealth that is urging that we keep the estate tax because he feels that he has plenty of money to be able to afford to pay the estate tax. I wish there were more wealthy people who had that sense of commitment to the larger community.
Buffalo, New York, Democrats line. You're next.
Yes, and I agree with, I didn't hear all of it, but I agree with most of what the speaker was saying, in that it's not the cost of the insurances and et cetera that's ruining the economy. It's the profits of it. This is not a game of cost of anything. It's the game of profits of everything. It used to be where the risk of insurance was supposed to be among the people, and the companies took a portion off as their profit. Now they don't want to have any risk at all. They don't want to pay out any money that they've taken in. They want everybody to just pay them premiums. They keep all the premiums and give you back nothing. And
anything to add?
Well, I think the problem of our health insurance system is largely the fact that it's dominated by private insurance companies. And as the caller says, private insurance companies keep too much of the money for fees. They keep too much of the money for marketing. They second-guess doctors. They deny patients treatments. We would be so much better off if we had a universal system and cut out the middleman. This is a middleman economy. Too many people on Wall Street extracting too many fees for not enough real benefit to the economy and putting the entire economy at risk.
Our guest is Robert Kuttner. His book, The Squandering of America, How the Failure of Our Politics Undermines Our Prosperity. White Marsh, Maryland. Go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. I'd like to hit on the fact that the black America, the middle-class America portion of the black community is falling behind and everything. And I think it has a lot to do basically with their people not hiring them on in the decent jobs and everything because of their criminal backgrounds, because of the war on drugs, which you picked up on the last segment. And I think it really just absolutely wipes them out. And you know, they can't, those who had chances of being helped up by their parents have been knocked back down, and then they can't help their children up the ladder and everything. And it's just, you know, it's the domino theory.
Okay, caller, we'll leave it there. Mr. Kuttner?
Well, I think one of the interesting statistics is that although black wages relative to white wages the difference is narrowed, black wealth relative to white wealth has stayed wildly apart. I think it's something like blacks on average have only 15% of the wealth that whites have on average. And of course, that's the legacy of segregation, and before that, that's the legacy of slavery. Blacks were just denied the ability to buy houses in decent neighborhoods, and they didn't have the capacity, because of discrimination, to accumulate wealth the same way whites did, and that cascades down onto the next generation. So if a upper middle class white kid goes to college, the parents are likely to pay the tuition. If that kid is buying his first home, the parents are likely to help with the down payment. But the young black person starting out and aspiring to the middle class, much, much less likely to have affluent parents who can give him or her a head start.
Take this article that the caller referred to from the Washington Post, Middle Class Dream Eludes African American Families, and juxtapose that with the front page of the USA Today, Dem profits as 113 campaign donors near $108,000 cap.
Yes.
Dozens of donors are nearing the $108,200 cap on federal campaign contributions for the 2008 election in a sign of the record-breaking cost. You write in your book about economic stressors and political participation.
Right, and I think the process of campaign finance, which is to say where people who run for office get their money, narrows the range of political debate in this country. If you are raising your money on Wall Street and you're a Democrat, even if you think that it's time to regulate banks so that we don't have a repeat of the subprime mess, but your donors are telling you don't touch that with a 10-foot pole, you're going to think twice. And in the House Financial Services Committee has done an investigation of subprime. Barney Frank has got a pretty good bill to regulate subprime, so this doesn't happen again. It's probably going to pass the House. But over in the Senate, you've got Chris Dodd busy running for president. I think the last time I looked, he's running behind Dennis Kucinich. So this is not a very promising campaign. But it gives Dodd a rationale for not taking up the bill. And Dodd, of course, has hedge funds headquartered in his state. He's got insurance companies headquartered in his state. He's not as aggressive a regulator. And I think too many Democrats, frankly, are in the tank because they're raising money in the same places that Republicans are raising money. And if you're getting your advice and your money from Wall Street, you're not going to be a tribune of the average person. I think that's why there's a vicious circle, to bring it back to your question, of people not participating in politics because they don't see politics delivering for them.
Bowie, Maryland, Republican line.
Hi, how you doing?
Go ahead, sir.
I just want to say it's about time I heard somebody talking some sense about the economic situation in this country. But
Thank you.
My question is, if nobody ever talks about the absorbent amount of money that we spend on federal pensions and health care for retired senators and employees of the government, if we did away with that in itself, in your opinion, wouldn't that be enough money to fix Social Security and provide health care for the entire nation? I mean, that's a lot of money.
Well, it's a lot of money, but there's only about 3 million federal employees in a country of 300 million people. I think federal employees are one of the last group of people who have decent health coverage and decent retirement coverage. Rather than taking it away from them, I would rather see other workers get secure retirement coverage of the kind that they used to have and get secure health care. And this country can afford it. I'm quoting Barney Frank again. People say that, how can we possibly afford this? And Barney got off a terrific line. He said, on September 10, 2001, we couldn't afford the Iraq War, but we found $200 billion to pay for the Iraq War. Now, if we can find that money, we can find money to pay for our people's needs at home.
Toledo, Ohio, Democrats line. You're next.
Yes, my name's Karen Dennison, and I'm a first-time caller. And this really affects me firsthand. I worked for a plant for 32 years, and because my plant moved to China, instead of getting the full benefits of my pension, I got 1/3, plus I was penalized 20% because it went out of business rather than just closing. I mean, closing. It moved instead of just closing. So I get $600 a month. Needless to say, I have to work 2 other jobs to try to make ends meet. And I'm 57 years old.
Mr. Kuttner?
Well, I think this caller speaks for more and more Americans. And our government has done a terrible job in preventing the ability of corporations to just walk away from their pensions. It's why I think pensions ought to be provided socially. It's not reasonable to expect a company like GM or Ford that is competing with companies from other countries that don't have to bear the cost of health insurance to have that come out of their bottom line. And I think the China problem is a whole other problem that makes our situation very challenging, in the sense that here's a country that is still a communist country, still a one-party state, a totalitarian state that doesn't recognize democratic rights, doesn't recognize worker rights, and yet American business finds it very convenient to do deals with China. So you have a totalitarian Chinese government supplying cheap, docile workers to capitalists. What kind of crazy mishmash is that? And I think if China is going to trade with the United States and be accorded the other rights that democratic countries get, we need to say to them, you can either have whatever system you want and pay tariffs, or if you want free trade with the United States, you have to adopt some of the practices that normal countries adopt. You have to allow freedom of association, you have to allow trade unions, you have to treat your workers decently. Until we do that, more and more jobs are going to go to China. And the other thing I think we fail to do is to recognize that as more and more of the American economy becomes a service economy, we need to make sure that those service jobs are decent jobs, because we're never going to get the manufacturing jobs back that we once had. If we don't lose them to China, we're going to lose them to automation. And service sector jobs can either be decent jobs or they can be bad jobs. We need efforts to make them be decent jobs. We need to pay them well.
Prince George, Virginia, you're next.
Yes, hello. How are both of y'all doing this morning?
Fine.
What I would like to say is that my grandfather was a part of this in the 1970s and 80s. He worked for a company called Peter and David, and they did the same thing as far as outsourcing their work overseas. What I think that the bad part about the American economy is that they've forgotten about the people who put them in that position of power, who fund them, and people need to realize that a lot of it is their negligence and their spending habits and everything else. But we need redistribution of wealth in this country because the people have become poor so that the wealthy can become richer. Excuse me. Y'all have a good evening.
What does that mean, redistribution of wealth, in your opinion?
Well, I think it means government playing the role that it played during the great post-war boom so that ordinary people get a fair shake. And part of that means restoring taxation based on the ability to pay rather than overtaxing the middle class and working people, taxing wealthy people at high rates, and then turning around and using the proceeds so that ordinary people have secure health coverage, secure pensions, restoring the right to bargain collectively, which dates back to the Wagner Act in 1935, which most companies don't respect, which the National Labor Relations Board doesn't enforce. I think it means paying for decent child care socially so that someone with children where both parents are working don't have to choose between the health of their child and their worry about whether they're going to be fired. It means a whole other strategy of how you run the economy. And if you listen to ordinary folks who are hurting economically, I think people are crying out for this kind of politics. And I know that there are people who get elected to the House and Senate who have this view. Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio was one of my favorites. He won going away by espousing the interests of ordinary people. I'd like to see more of this at the level of presidential politics.
Well, you mentioned presidential politics. Who running right now is talking the way that you're talking?
I think Edwards comes closest. But I said to Edwards the last time I talked to him, you know, Senator, if you only talk about the very poor, maybe you'll go to heaven. But if you talk about the bottom 70 or 80% who were as vulnerable almost as the poor, maybe you'll go to the White House. And I think there's a populist politics that addresses the insecurity that ordinary people face that voters are just hungering for.
Are you part of the Edwards campaign?
No.
Are you consulting with any presidential
No,
candidates?
I'm not consulting with any presidential candidate. I'm a journalist. I write books. I hope somebody pays attention. But I think if you look at all the turbulence on Wall Street, I think events are going to force candidates to take a more assertive view about how we fix the economy so that it serves ordinary people.
Mayflower, Arkansas, Republican line.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'd like to talk about socialized medicine. I've been treating at the University of Arkansas Medical Science, and I don't know where this man is getting his facts from. If you sat down in the lobby down there and talked to people that's coming in from Canada, Spain, England, France, Mexico, they're all saying the same thing. Do not get socialized medicine. It is a disaster for people that need treatment. And I sat there and listened to it. I've been in the treatment center now for about a year and a half. And it's pathetic when a man sits here and tells me, and people coming from all 40 different countries around the world, to the best treatment center of cancer in the world down there. And he's sitting there and telling me that socialized medicine is the answer, when everybody that comes through there says, stay away from it.
We got your point, caller.
Well, I would ask the caller how he likes Medicare. Most Americans, 85, 90% of Americans, like Medicare, like the fact that it's coverage that can never be taken away, like the fact that there's complete free choice, and that's our one island of universal medicine that's not paid for by private insurance companies. And so there are far fewer middlemen. I also, the Commonwealth Fund has a study out, very reputable foundation that's been around since 1917, where they looked at the statistics and they polled people in different countries. In almost every country, there's a higher degree of satisfaction with the health system, And we have the third lowest life expectancy of all advanced countries. So, yeah, there may be some people who are unhappy, but most people much prefer the security of a system where you can pick your own doctor, you can pick your own hospital, they can't take the coverage away because you have a pre-existing condition, and you're covered no matter what.
St. Augustine, Florida, you're next.
Good morning. You get a lot of these seminar callers from, from conservative talk radio. Their mission is to, when somebody says socialized medicine, you identify them right away. Let me tell you a short little good story that you can contradict anything that's been said about foreign medicine. In the early 80s, 3 people I know personally, young teenage boys, contacted the HIV virus from a Baptist youth counselor at a training center, whatever. The 2 that stayed in America, one of them moved to Amsterdam. The 2 that lived in America bankrupted their families and died in the year 1986. The one that lives in Amsterdam is still alive. It costs him $0 for his health insurance. He gets the very best treatment, the very best drugs. He's alive and well today. So is that a very simple explanation of it?
Well, again, I think I don't want to repeat myself. I think if you do a dispassionate look at life expectancy, quality of care, security of care, universal systems work better. But, Americans are very patriotic, and we don't like the idea that some other country might be doing it better than we do. So we don't even have to look to Europe. All we have to do is look to Medicare, which is more efficient and fairer and more secure than any of these HMOs that we all hate.
Kings Mountain, North Carolina, Democrats line.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I was curious if you see any parallels between the current mortgage crisis and the savings and loan crisis of the late 80s and early 90s. And why didn't we learn any lessons from that? And also, if you could maybe elaborate on I see a hedge fund bubble coming and a credit card bubble coming. And I thought maybe if you could elaborate on that and its ramifications. And lastly, I think a lot of this basically boils down to a Keynesian mixed model versus a Friedman caveat emptor model. And I think Americans need to wake up and look at what's going on, or we will be a third world nation. Maybe not in my lifetime, but it's going to happen.
Well, it's a great question. Some people call this the United States of amnesia. I mean, we forget the lessons of the past. We forget the lessons of 1929, and we forget something as recent as the savings and loan collapse of the 1980s. They deregulated savings and loans when Reagan came in, and so they allowed savings and loans, which had traditionally been just dedicated to housing, had been nonprofits, most of them, and very successful. You didn't have savings and loan collapses in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and 70s because they stuck to their knitting. And the rate of home ownership increased dramatically in those years. So in the 80s, they got cute, and they got Congress to waive the rules, and they ended up costing the taxpayers $400 billion in hits to the insurance fund, so that people wouldn't lose their deposits, even though some of these savings and loans lost their shirts. So in 1989, Congress re-regulated, and it limited savings and loans' ability to be speculative. After that happened, the wise guys on Wall Street figured out that if you set up a mortgage company that was not federally regulated, and you got some bank to package the loans and turn them into bonds, and find some consenting adult to buy the bonds, you could play the same sorts of games. And because they're not federally insured, because they're not real banks, the taxpayers aren't taking a hit yet, but the rest of the economy is taking a hit. And all of these losses on the books of banks and in the Fed having to cheapen money below what it would otherwise put interest rates at, which has cost to inflation, cost to the dollar, and it's another casualty of the myth that markets can regulate themselves. if markets could regulate themselves, you wouldn't have the Federal Reserve and the Treasury rushing in to bail them out.
Next phone call, Hammond, Indiana, Republican line.
Good morning. I am so glad I got in on this conversation because this has been bugging me for a long time. This guy, I don't know where he's from or what kind of experience he's had. I think he's kind of shading the truth a little bit about who he's working for in a campaign. But my husband works at our local steel mill here, and he's been there for 32 years. And about 10 years ago, he was almost getting ready to be laid off. The mill was going to shut down, and because when President Bush did all the tax cuts and everything, his mill they were able to afford to invest in his mill. Now the owner of the mill now is invested worldwide, and my husband is. I shredded old pay stubs from the 90s during the Clinton years, and compared them to, before I shredded them, I compared them to his paychecks now. He's making like 4, 5, 6 times more money than he did in the 90s under the Clintons. And in the 90s, we weren't able to buy a home because the rates were like from 13 on up to 18%. We couldn't afford it. So we bought a house a couple years ago, and all this subprime mess, I feel sorry for those people, but you know, that's what I love about you liberals. You make the majority of the people like morons. Like, we don't have a mind. We can't think and make decisions on our own. We need the government to do it.
Okay, caller, we'll have to leave it there because we've run out of time. You're our last phone call. Go ahead, Mr. Kuttner.
Well, your husband's very fortunate because the steel industry in this country has shrunk dramatically because the Koreans and the Japanese and the Chinese subsidize their steel industries and take American jobs. There are some jobs left in the United States, but that industry is shrinking. Mortgage interest rates were not 13 to 18% in the 1990s. So I just want to correct that fact. I don't think government needs to step in because people are stupid. People are smart, and people are smart enough to know that this economy is not serving a lot of people, and government can do great things. It's done great things in the past, and programs like Medicare, programs like Social Security, programs like public universities serve ordinary people. This is not because people are stupid. This is because most people welcome that kind of help.
We have about 1 more minute here. Explain real quickly your background in economics.
Well, I've been an economics journalist for almost 40 years. I was a columnist for Business Week for 20 years. I was an economics editor of the New Republic. I've written 7 books. I was a founder of the American Prospect and the Economic Policy Institute, and I'm a senior fellow at the think tank Demos.
And attended the London School of Economics.
Oberlin College, University of California, Berkeley, and the London School of Economics.
All right. Robert Kuttner, thank you for your time
Thanks
this morning.
Thanks so much for having me.
We are going